Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ed Jurechin, the director of the Baker Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this afternoon for this special event. I want to thank the Baker Institute Student Forum for being one of the chief sponsors of this event, also the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Affairs Council, cooperative venture of getting our keynote speaker here to Houston. Michael Mandelbaum, as you can see in the bio, is the Christian Herder Professor of American Foreign Policy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also taught at Harvard and Columbia and the Naval Academy, and he's a senior fellow in the Council on Foreign Relations. Not a bad set of titles. He's a regular foreign affairs columnist for Newsday. He's the associate director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Project on American Relations with the Former Communist World. And he's on the board of advisors of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's a graduate of Yale College. I'll mention that to my daughter, Michael, who's a sophomore at Yale. And he earned his master's degree at King's College in Cambridge and his doctorate at Harvard University. He has authored many books, and I won't go through all the titles, and edited 12 books, but you can see that he is a real expert on nuclear weaponry and nuclear weapon strategy. Some of his book titles are The Nuclear Question, United States and Nuclear Weapons, The Nuclear Revolution, The Nuclear Future, Reagan and Gorbachev, The Fate of Nations, and many others. And of course, he is now authored a new book, The Ideas That Conquered the World, that has received quite a bit of attention nationally and internationally. And I understand that there will be a book signing after. And it offers a major new statement about the fault lines of the 21st century, which we will be listening to Michael very closely on. I don't know how you did this, Michael, but to get a quote from Henry Kissinger for your book that it's thought-provoking is what we would call a conceptual breakthrough. For Henry Kissinger to say anything that other than what he has enunciated is thought-provoking is quite a major accomplishment. And also Tom Friedman's, one of his articles in which he cites your work extensively is another, I think, real strong praise in your direction. I told Michael that I've known Michael for many years. Our families know each other, and I think one of the many mistakes the Clinton administration made, but one of them that was one of the key mistakes is not really convincing Michael to come on board as one of the top policy advisors. The offer was made, a very responsible position, but I think that Michael represents one of the most serious, and I will use the word of Kissinger, thought-provoking, conceptual thinkers amongst the Democrats, and he is made a major contribution, and I think he could have played a tremendous role in the Clinton administration. They asked him, but they didn't convince him. I fault him for not convincing him. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Michael Mandelbaum to the podium.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be at this distinguished university, my first visit, and addressing one of the most, at least by reputation, and the brief encounters I've had only confirm that reputation, one of the most talented student bodies in the country. And it is also a distinct pleasure and privilege to be able to speak under the auspices of the Baker Institute, which, under Ambassador Jurigian's leadership, has managed the remarkable feat of putting itself squarely on the map in the front rank of public policy think tanks in a very few years. I can think of no other institute which has done anything comparable, and Ed, it's a great credit to you and your colleagues. I'm going to speak today about my recently published book, The Ideas That Conquered the World, which I wrote for a particular purpose. And that purpose is to supply a context into which to fit the disparate events from terrorism to globalization, from Chinese succession politics to Argentine economic crises, that pass before us every day in the pages of our newspapers and on television. The purpose of this book, that is to offer a framework, to provide an overview. The subject of The Ideas That Conquered the World is the big picture. Now, we had such a framework during the Cold War, and that framework, for those of you who weren't following these matters during the Cold War, and that, I guess, includes the majority of us in this room, that framework was the Cold War itself. During most of the second half of the 20th century, it now seems a long time ago, but to some of us it was only yesterday, almost everything that happened in the world either derived from or could be related to the great global struggle between East and West. But then the Cold War ended and our framework dissolved. The purpose of The Ideas That Conquered the World is to offer a replacement for the Cold War, not the Cold War as a global event, but the Cold War as a conceptual framework. And the replacement that I propose in the book is the supremacy of three great ideas: peace as a method for organizing international relations, democracy as the optimal form of government, and the free market as the best way of structuring economic life. The thesis of this book is that the central fact of the 21st century is the triumph of our liberal ideas. Now, that bald statement immediately requires at least three qualifications. First, how can I say that these ideas have triumphed? It's obvious that they haven't triumphed everywhere. Peace, democracy, and free markets do not appear all over the planet. The world is not wholly peaceful, and it's certainly not entirely democratic, although the free market is pretty close to a universal institution these days. What I mean by the triumph of these ideas is that now, for the first time since these ideas were introduced in the second half of the 18th century, they have no serious rivals as formats for organizing social life. The status of peace, democracy, and free markets that I see in the 21st century is captured by a story I tell in the book about a French architect who was asked where in Paris he would most like to live. He replied, the Eiffel Tower, on the grounds that that was the one place in the city where he wouldn't have to look at it. Well, peace, democracy, and free markets are the Eiffel Tower of the 21st century. Not everybody has embraced them, and we learned to our cost and our sorrow on September 11, 2001, that there are people in the world who are violently opposed to these three ideas, but no one can ignore them. Everyone has to come to terms with them. The second term in this bald statement of the thesis of the book that requires qualification is our ideas. Who, in this case, are we? Well, we are not just Americans. These three great ideas were invented in the second half of the 18th century, largely in Great Britain and secondarily in France. So they are Western in origin. But they're no longer exclusively Western. They have become universal. Japan is as much a market economy as Great Britain is. India is a democracy like the United States. And this universal character of these three ideas is the source of their appeal. It's not necessary to side with the United States on everything or on anything to embrace them. It's perfectly possible to be pro-democracy and anti-American. A certain country in Western Europe, noted for its fashion and cuisine, comes to mind in this regard. Well, the third qualification has to do with the term liberal. What do I mean by the triumph of our liberal ideas? I don't use the term in the way it is ordinarily used in the everyday discourse of American politics, in which liberals oppose conservatives over issues of abortion and taxation. Rather, I mean liberal in the classic 19th century sense of the term, the original sense, liberalism meaning for liberty. In this sense, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike in this country are all liberals. Well, the book is divided into three parts. The first concerns history, the second, foreign and security policies, the third, politics and economics. And I'd like to say a brief word about each of those three parts. The first section on history has as its purpose to fit the present moment into the history of the last 200 years. There's much to say about this subject, but here I'd like to stress 2 points in particular. First, I see modern history as a battle of ideas about how to organize and manage the world. In the 19th century, that battle pitted liberal, modern ideas, peace, democracy, and free markets, against the traditional ways that held sway for centuries over much of the planet, and according to which war was, if not necessarily desirable, certainly normal. Kings and emperors ruled on the basis of heredity, and economic life was destined to be forever stagnant. These traditional ideas lost ground steadily during the 19th century and were swept away by World War I. But in their place, there arose another set of ideas to compete with liberalism. I call this 20th century competitor illiberalism, as a way of grouping both fascism and communism under one rubric. Those two 20th century ideologies differed in important ways, but they also had certain basic elements in common. Each of them glorified war. Each of them practiced government by self-selected dictatorship. And each of them sought to exert extensive, in the case of communism, almost total government control over economic life. Fascism was defeated in World War II. Orthodox communism in Europe collapsed at the end of the Cold War, leaving liberal ideas without serious rivals for the first time. This leads me to the second point of part one of the ideas that conquered the world that I want to stress here. In this first section of the book, I offer a reinterpretation of the Cold War. The Cold War resembled other great wars of the modern period, the Napoleonic Wars of the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, and World Wars I and II of the 20th century. All of these wars were global struggles, the outcomes of which transformed the world. But the Cold War was unlike the others in that it was not won by force of arms, but rather by force of example. The success of the West, of our societies, our political systems, and above all, our economies, was the key to the collapse of communism. And this point is, I think, worth stressing, not only in order to understand the past, but to understand the present and the future as well. For the Western, and now the universal, liberal example remains potent in the wake of the Cold War. The forces that brought down communism are still operating. They exert, I believe, a gravitational pull on the whole world. That leads me to part two of the ideas that conquered the world about foreign and security policy, the title of which is The Invention of Peace. The main point here is that in Europe, at the end of the 20th century, there arose, almost by accident, an answer to a crucial age-old question. That question is how, in a world of sovereign, independent states without any world government to keep order, is it possible to have not just armed truces, which are familiar throughout history, but something deeper and more lasting, genuine peace. In Europe, at the end of the 20th century, there arose a formula for this deeper peace that has two parts, both of which involve armed forces. First, all the armed forces in Europe, including those of the United States, which for these purposes is very much a European power, are configured for defending but not for attacking territory. Second, all armed forces in Europe practice transparency, the principle by which every government knows precisely which forces all other governments have and what these other governments are doing with their forces at all times. These two principles have combined to generate a level of confidence that underpins a deeper peace than the European continent has ever known. The key to adopting this formula for peace, I argue in part 2 of the Ideas That Conquered the World, is a cluster of attitudes involving the use of force that evolved in the West, although not, unfortunately, thus far elsewhere, over the second half of the 20th century, which I call warlessness. By that I mean a pronounced, principled, widespread aversion to the use of force. In a chapter in part 2 of the book entitled The Cure for Cancer, I describe the origins of what I call the common security order in Europe. And in the next chapter, entitled The Most Dangerous Place on the Planet, I assess the prospects for establishing a comparable set of security arrangements in the other part of the world where a conflict that could reach global dimensions could begin, namely East Asia. In recent weeks, the news coming out of East Asia has emphasized the threat to security posed by nuclear developments on the Korean Peninsula. And these are indeed important, but the central issue for the future of East Asian security involves China, Chinese foreign policy, and China's relations with its neighbors. Here, in this chapter, I find both good news and bad news. The good news is that, in my judgment, there is only one issue over which China might fight a war that could spread throughout East Asia and elsewhere. That issue is the unresolved status of Taiwan. The bad news is that at this point there is no solution in sight for this problem that is satisfactory to all parties concerned. I certainly do not believe that war in East Asia, war involving China, war over the status of Taiwan is inevitable. Indeed, I don't even believe that it is likely, but it is possible. And if such a war should break out, it could involve two important nuclear-armed powers, the United States and the People's Republic of China. That is why, in this book, I call East Asia the most dangerous place on the planet. Now, peace is obviously not universal in the wake of the Cold War. How do I account for that? Well, I begin to account for it by dividing the world of the 21st century into two major categories. One of these categories I call the core, which consists of the wealthy, powerful countries of Western Europe, North America, and Japan. These are countries in which new ideas and new products are invented, and the world's core enjoys unprecedented peace. The second category, which I call the periphery, involves everybody else, the countries in what we used to call, during the Cold War, the Third World. These are countries to which new ideas and new products diffuse. And this part of the world, this agglomeration of heterogeneous countries is, as newspapers and television remind us every day, very far from tranquil. Indeed, the periphery is arguably less orderly, less peaceful now than it was during the Cold War. Why is that? Well, I believe that the peace of the core and the disorder of the periphery are related. Traditionally, I believe, great powers like the United States have been interested in the periphery for geostrategic reasons, as part of their rivalries between and among themselves. We can see this principle operating in the recent history of our own country. The United States fought two substantial wars in Asia in the second half of the 20th century, one in Korea, the second in Indochina. And it fought these wars not because Korea or Indochina was of any intrinsic importance to the United States at the times the wars were waged, but rather as part of the larger conflict the United States was pursuing with its great geopolitical rival, the other core great power of the second half of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. The United States during the Cold War, and almost every great power for almost all of history, saw the world as a kind of chessboard in which every part was connected with every other part. And the United States, like other great powers, followed the rule of strategic prudence in chess. Take care of the pawns on the chessboard, lest the loss of one lead to a series of events that could inflict great danger and great damage. Great powers cared about the pawns of the world during the Cold War, and for most of recorded history before that, for reasons of rivalry with other great powers. But in the wake of the Cold War, at the outset of the 21st century, with great power rivalry, if not abolished for all time, then certainly in abeyance, this is no longer true. The chief source of the interest of the rich countries in the poor has disappeared. And that, I believe, is a principal reason for the turbulence we observe in these poor countries. For on the whole, and with important exceptions, I believe that during the Cold War, the interest that the rich countries, that the core countries took in the periphery helped to promote stability. The sources of stability in the world's periphery during the Cold War have now gone, leading to the disorder that we observe. Now, to the disconnection between core and periphery that I believe is characteristic of the world of the 21st century, there is one towering exception. There is one part of the planet from which emanate real threats to the core. That part is the Middle East. The Middle East is home to the world's largest deposits of oil, the cutoff of which could and would inflict severe damage on Western economies. The Middle East is also home to regimes that define their interests in ways radically antithetical to those of the United States and other Western countries, and that are seeking weapons of mass destruction to pursue those interests. The obvious example is Iraq. And as we were reminded or informed to our sorrow and to our loss on September 11, 2001, the Middle East is the incubator of the kind of terrorism that has the capacity to reach North America, to reach us. The Middle East is the subject of a separate chapter of this book, which therefore bears on current concerns. And all this raises the question, what can be done to deal with the problems that we observe in the Middle East and in so much of the rest of the world's periphery? My answer is that the solution to their problems lies in the implantation in countries where they do not exist or are weakly rooted of peace, democracy, and free markets. What are the chances that this will happen during the early decades of this century? Well, that question is at the center of the book's third part. The title of part 3 of the Ideas That Conquered the World is The Liberal Theory of History. By this phrase, I mean a widely held, if seldom systematically articulated view that there is a relationship among these three great liberal ideas, that they go together, that one leads to, or at least helps to foster, the others. Put this way, this sounds perhaps too good to be true. But the fact that something sounds too good to be true doesn't necessarily mean that it is not true. And in fact, in part 3 of this book, I find considerable evidence in favor of two propositions that lie at the heart of what I've called the liberal theory of history. The first of these propositions is that democracies tend to conduct peaceful foreign policies. Now, those of you who are studying political science will recognize that the so-called democratic peace hypothesis has been the subject of an enormous amount of research and controversy in political studies over the last quarter century. My own conclusion about this hypothesis is that it is true as long as it is recognized that democracy consists not just of elections, which are relatively easy to stage, but also, and equally importantly, constitutionalism, the rule of law, the protection of rights, especially the rights of minorities, something that is harder to establish and unfortunately rarer in the world than the conduct of elections. The second proposition at the heart of the liberal theory of history for which I find evidence is that market economies tend to become political democracies. Now, there is nothing automatic about this. This is not a law of history like a law of physics, if only because there are no laws of history like the invariant laws of physics. But the association between free markets and democratic politics is, I believe, a tendency, a proposition, a matter, as I detail in the book, of both logic and historical evidence. And this association means that perhaps the most important development in the world at the outset of the 21st century is the virtually universal embrace of the free market. Indeed, in the book, I go so far as to venture the supposition that the free market has become the most popular and widely legitimate institution in all of human history. But even this assertion requires qualification. First, despite the universal popularity of the free market, it has proven, especially since the collapse of orthodox communism in Europe, far more difficult to construct working, effective free markets where they don't exist than we believed for most of the 20th century. The struggle to construct working, effective markets is, I believe, the most important public business in much of the world. And in particular, I believe and argue in the book that it is the most important piece of public business in Russia and China, two countries whose economic problems are, I believe, more similar than is generally realized, and two countries to which this book devotes considerable attention. The second qualification to the universal popularity of markets is that markets are certainly not without problems. They're not without problems even where they are well established and work effectively in countries such as our own. That means that while I believe that the 21st century will be the age of the market, the 21st century will not be without problems. Rather, the characteristic problems of the 21st century, if things go well, will be those problems that markets present. And part 3 of this book examines these problems at some length. Well, in conclusion, two thoughts about the United States and one more general point about this book. The United States is certainly the most important country in the world today, and that is so in no small part because it is the United States that bears the greatest responsibility for fostering and sustaining the conditions in which peace, democracy, and free markets can flourish. About the United States and its role in the world, the book has two contrarian points to make, two departures from the prevailing wisdom. The first is that although the world is now loudly and publicly concerned that the United States is overly active in the world, the term rogue superpower is muttered in some circles in Europe, I believe that there is an equal danger that over the medium and long term, the United States will not be active enough in the international arena. I believe that there is a real chance that this country will be too reticent to do the kinds of things that even those governments most critical of one American foreign policy or another want the United States to do in the 21st century. And I say why I think this is so in the book. The second contrarian point about the United States has to do with American power. It is surely very great. But in important ways, I believe this enormous American power is actually irrelevant. After all, the great goal of the United States in the world in the 21st century is to foster peace, democracy, and free markets where they don't exist, and above all, in Russia and China. For these tasks, the American, and more importantly, the now universal liberal examples are unprecedentedly potent. But the actual tools of American foreign policy, guns, money, and words suggesting that either or both might be used, are, I believe, of not much value. When it comes to installing free markets and building democracies, countries that don't have them must do these things for themselves. I illustrate this point in the book with a version of the venerable American light bulb joke. This one goes, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is none. The light bulb has to want to change itself. Well, similarly, in order to spread democracy and free markets and thus ultimately peace to countries where these do not exist, the countries themselves must want to have them and must build them themselves. The Ideas That Conquered the World is contrarian in a final way. As will be obvious to all of you, this is a book whose tone and tenor is optimistic. And for some people, especially some of my colleagues in the Academy, optimism about the future of the world is not only wrong, it's unacceptable. Some people will forgive anything but optimism. And so the message that I've received in comments and questions and responses to talks and even in reviews of the book, which on the whole have been very generous, has been not so much I disagree, but rather, how dare you say that? To which my response is that I say this because all the evidence that I see supports the proposition that with all the problems and difficulties that the world has, and will surely always have, with all the issues that beset and bedevil us, despite all that, the world is going our way. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you. Sure, be happy.
Okay. Michael has very generously agreed to take questions. If you'll raise your hand and identify yourselves. Do we have microphones? If you wait for the microphone to come up to you right here. While we're waiting for the microphone, let me just remind the audience that copies of Mr. Mandelbaum's book are available for sale in the lobby. He will remain for a few minutes to autograph copies and visit with the members of the audience. And a table for him to sign books will be brought in the back of the Commons near the round table. And there'll be a photo op with the students that also will be arranged. Okay, first question.
Yeah. Excuse me. Hi, my name's Doug Schuler. I'm a professor here in the business school. My question is this: are you optimistic that your predictions are going to be correct, or are you optimistic normatively that democracy and free markets are a good way to organize society?
Well, I would say that I'm confident about the second and optimistic about the first. I sometimes say that this book comes with a 25-year guarantee. That is, after 25 years, I take no responsibility for what happens because the time horizon, the number of years that one can even hope or pretend to peer into the future is no more than a quarter century, and that's because the only constant in this world is change. We know things are changing rapidly. We know that there will be surprises. But what gives me confidence, and to the extent that I have it in this prediction, is the absence of any alternatives to these three great ideas. And this is the first time, as I said in my talk, since they were introduced, that there is no competition. peace, democracy, and free markets have a very strong track record, and that's the reason for the near universality of free markets, or at least the desire, the aspiration for working free markets. It turns out, as I mentioned, to be more difficult than we supposed actually to implement free markets. So the demand, especially for free markets, is quite considerable. But even if and where and as free markets fail, as they surely do all the time, and as they may in a rather large way, unlike the great failure of the free market in the 20th century, the Great Depression of the 1930s, there are no alternative models waiting to be tried. When the Western economies collapsed in the 1930s, fascism and communism offered alternatives that looked promising and for a while were successful. The experiments in both ended in failure, indeed in disaster, but that couldn't easily have been foretold at the beginning. Well, now there is no alternative, and although I don't regard human ingenuity as being incapable of devising alternatives to peace, democracy, and free markets, so far no alternatives are on the horizon, and unless and until there are alternatives, I think it's possible to have some confidence that these three ideas and their institutional embodiments will continue to be central, will continue to be attractive, and will continue to attract countries as ways to organize their public lives.
My name is William Altman. I'm chairman of the U.S. Baltic Foundation in Washington, D.C., and your remarks are very encouraging, but I wonder, would you agree perhaps they might imply a significant increased role for the National Endowment for Democracy and institutions such as Radio Liberty to help promote some of these ideas?
I'm skeptical about the capacity of the American government using its tools and institutions actually to promote these ideas. I don't think the National Endowment for Democracy does any harm, although I sometimes wonder whether its existence isn't testimony more to the oversupply of PhDs in political science than to any demonstrated track record in actually establishing democracy. But I think these are worthy institutions and worthy people, but when it comes to adopting political systems, and indeed when it comes to doing almost anything, and this I think is true of individuals as well as collectives, people are more impressed by what they notice than what they're told. It's the American example, and as I say, more broadly, the global liberal example that impresses people, not American missionaries for liberal politics, worthy though they are. Democracy will make headway and has made headway because it appears to work, not because people from Washington say that it ought to be adopted. So it does seem to me that this is one of those instances where the examples are enormously potent, but actual tools, especially tools of government, may well not make much difference.
Hi, I'm Nancy Dunlap. I'm a member of the Baker Institute Roundtable. In the past few weeks, The Economist magazine tried to do an assessment of whether there was growing differences between the U.S. and Western Europe, both of whom would fall into the core category of countries. And to my surprise, they indicated that the European countries, predominantly France and Germany, were less morally inclined in their political attitudes, and the U.S. was becoming more morally inclined in its political attitudes and the resulting foreign policy. That came as somewhat of a surprise to me, those of us who've been taught 17th, 18th, 19th century Western European literature and philosophy. Did you find similar divergences growing? Would you support that? And wouldn't that be somewhat risky for the concept that the core countries tend to approach things compatibly?
Well, that's a good question. I saw that article, and I've seen the surveys on which the article is based. But I would not count myself as surprised. The moralism of American public life and the distinction between American moralism and European realism or cynicism, depending on how you want to classify it, is, I think, at least 2 centuries old. The United States was founded as an ideological nation, and America's principles have been important ever since, in no small part because that is the basis of American nationality and American nationhood. This is a nation of immigrants who come here and agree on a certain set of precepts, which makes those precepts very important, whereas France, Britain, Germany, and most nations in Europe are simply people who share a common language and background and have lived on the same territory for a very long time. So I think that distinction is not a new one, and it does make a difference. It is, and we see that difference throughout history. It was, after all, the United States that popularized the notion of human rights as an issue in foreign policy, much to the chagrin of the Europeans when it was first raised. The term realpolitik, the idea of approaching foreign policy purely on the basis of calculations of power, is a European one, not an American one. It has a faintly disreputable odor in the United States. So I think the differences in value and the differences in approach are real. But having said that, I think that we and the Europeans have more in common, or at least the things that we have in common are more important than the things that divide us. There is a commitment to peace, democracy, and free markets, although it may be louder and somewhat more strident on this side of the Atlantic than on the other side. And I would classify the differences that we observe between the United States on the one hand and some, although not all, European countries on the other, over a whole host of issues, most notably these days the approach to Iraq, as being a kind of difference within the democratic international community. I think it shows that we are building a kind of international community of democracies that resembles in some ways democracies within particular countries. After all, democracies don't agree on everything. Politics within democracies is very noisy and contentious. Democracy makes the world safe for differences and disagreements. But within functioning democracies, and I think within the transatlantic democratic community, 2 things are true. First, disagreements are about secondary, not primary issues. And here we can see this principle in operation in the disagreement about Iraq. There is a real disagreement between the American government on the one hand and the French and German government on the other about how to deal with Saddam Hussein, but there is no disagreement about the basic principle that Saddam should be disarmed. So here we have the kind of disagreement between and among democratic allies that is characteristic of politics within a democracy. And the second feature of politics within a democracy also, I believe, applies to the disagreements between and among democracies, and that is the clear understanding that however deep the differences, they will not be settled by force. That is true here as well. So I think what we see in the debate over Iraq is a preview of things to come. The United States and Western Europe are not going to agree on a whole host of issues, and the disagreements are going to be noisier, more numerous, and more manifest than they were during the Cold War, when we were welded together by a common threat. But that does not mean that we will ever go to war over these disagreements, and it does not mean that we won't, in the end, be able to strike a compromise and come together for some common tasks.
1 and then 2, lady, right behind you.
Hi, I'm Ashley Leeds. I'm a professor of political science here at Rice. And I'm curious by something that sounded to me as a potential contradiction in your remarks, and I'm hoping that you can clarify this for me. You said that you're concerned that the U.S. withdraw too much from the world, that you'd like to see the U.S. become more involved in the world in the 21st century. And yet you've also expressed skepticism that the traditional tools of foreign policy can be useful for the things that you hope can be achieved. You've suggested that rather the United States should serve as an exemplar of these policies rather than promoting them abroad. So could you clarify further what you see as the appropriate involvement of the U.S. in the world? What kinds of foreign policy tools should we be adopting in order to achieve these goals?
Very good question. I think there are 2 arenas in which an American role is important. One is security, the other is economics. So let me describe very briefly the role I think the United States should play in both spheres. In the security sphere, I think the American presence, a continuing American presence, although not necessarily a large one, in both Western Europe and East Asia is important for the purposes of promoting political and military stability. And I argue at some length in favor of that position in the book. But I think that there is every chance that the American public will grow tired of paying for these so-called forward deployments, even though they aren't all that expensive. And fatigue with being present out there beyond America's borders will only, I think, be aggravated by the kinds of disagreements with our allies that are inevitable. I would guess that as a result of what we have learned and seen about America's relations with our South Korean ally over the last several weeks, that the enthusiasm in the wider American public for continuing to have 37,000 American troops on the Korean Peninsula has been somewhat diminished. But I think it is constructive for American troops to be in the Western Pacific, on the Korean Peninsula, and in the middle of Europe. And I worry, or at least I should say, I am not sure that the American public will continue to support that. In the economic sphere, it is the United States that has been the mainstay of an open, global, international economic order. This is true for both trade and monetary affairs. The United States has been the mainstay for free trade since the creation of the international economic order that we now have at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. But even there, American enthusiasm for keeping trade free, for opening new avenues of international commerce may well flag. For in every country and in every democracy, there is always bound to be a backlash against trade. This is so because trade, like other kinds of market activities, generates winners but also losers. And the losers have a tendency, not surprisingly, to identify themselves, organize, band together, and try to redress their grievances by keeping trade restricted. As I say, this I take to be a normal feature of politics in any government with a market economy. So the battles over protectionism that we've seen in the United States, we will continue to see. But because of the crucial central role that the United States plays in sustaining an open world trading system, these domestic political battles have global implications. And if the forces of protection should gain the upper hand, this, I think, would have serious negative consequences for the international economic order and therefore for the prospects for free market. The same could be said with some important modifications about the international monetary system. So that it is in these spheres that I express the concern that the public support for a rather robust American role, public support that was forthcoming during the Cold War because of the Cold War, because these American international roles could be portrayed and really were exercises in self-protection. With the passing of the Cold War, I think it is entirely possible that the necessary political support on which this kind of American security and international economic role must rest may dwindle to the point that these roles are jeopardized.
This is going to have to be the last question. Charles Foster.
My name is Charles Foster, and I'm a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. The other day, Thomas Friedman, that Ed referred to, made an interesting observation about both liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans and the prospects of war with Iraq, saying, and this sort of coincided with what you mentioned the other day, that generally the liberal Democrats were not giving the president the benefit of the not giving him credit for the benefits of a war, because if we did have a successful war with Iraq, that one of the benefits would be that the U.S. could help, under our auspices, establish a democracy and a more open society, precisely what you called for in terms of what you think is needed in Iraq. So your comments on Thomas Friedman's column.
Well, Tom Friedman's Wednesday column, I think it was, said he was going to say why liberals don't appreciate the benefits of the war, and then the following column, which I think is not run yet, was going to describe why conservatives don't appreciate the dangers of a war. Let me make a couple of comments about that. I usually agree with Tom on almost everything. He said one thing in that column with which I am inclined to dissent, although I haven't really thought it through. And this is an important point because I think one of, to me, the most powerful and logically coherent cases against the war is one made by a number of my fellow academics. Those of you who are familiar with political science and international relations will probably know their names: John Mearsheimer and John Mearsheimer of Chicago and Steve Walt of Harvard. They have an article in the latest Foreign Policy. Jack Snyder and Bob Jervis at Columbia, Barry Posen and Steve Van Ever at MIT. And their argument is this war is unnecessary because we can deter Saddam. And even if he gets nuclear weapons, we can deter him, and therefore it's not worth going to war. Deterrence will operate effectively, as it has since the Gulf War, and as it did during the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So Tom's argument is, he doesn't treat this at any length, but he concedes that point and says if you want to be for a war, the real reason is for regime change. And the reason regime change is important is that it's important to do something to reverse the trends of the Arab world. Otherwise, things will only get worse for them and for us. I'm not so sure that we can be quite so confident about deterring Saddam. This is a longer argument, and I haven't worked it out in my own mind. I don't mean that Saddam would be tempted to launch a nuclear assault on the United States, even if he got nuclear weapons and got the means of delivery, but rather that Saddam, equipped with nuclear weapons, would be able to throw his weight around in that part of the world in a way that would be detrimental to our interests. So having said that, let me address the issue of democratization in Iraq, but I should also say that standing next to me is somebody who knows far more about this issue than I. So anybody who is interested in this issue should consult Ambassador Jirijian, both because of his long experience in this part of the world and because of some of the studies over which he has presided recently. But I think we can say at least four things about the prospects for democracy in Iraq should Saddam be forcibly removed. We can't say whether it will be a democracy or not. But first we can say that there are Democrats in Iraq, and there are Democrats all over the Arab world. We don't know how many, but these are intelligent, sophisticated, attentive people. They can observe the world. I don't believe that Arabs or any other people take the position that democracy is okay for other people but not for us. And the reason that we don't hear their voices much is that it's politically dangerous to raise them. So there certainly is some basis for democracy in that part of the world, as there is in every part of the world. Second, we ought to remind ourselves of what is obvious, and that is the first and foremost, although not the only obstacle to democracy in Iraq and in many countries where it does not exist, is the current regime, which is determined to use force to prevent it. So the removal of this regime is a necessary condition for democracy in Iraq. But alas, it's probably not a sufficient condition. One of the themes of the ideas that conquered the world, and this is my third point, is that democracy and free markets require institutions. They require political parties. They require the rule of law. They require people with certain skills and certain expectations. They require things, in other words, that can probably only be built over time. I'm not talking centuries, but I think probably a generation is needed to install a rough-and-ready democracy or a rough-and-ready free market where there's no basis for one. Whether the basis for doing better, faster in Iraq exists, I think, is something about which we have to be dubious, which suggests that if we are determined to give Iraq the best chance possible to construct a democracy, that might well call for a protracted international presence, but an international presence might well be unacceptable both to the international community and to the Iraqi people for other reasons. But that's my third point. The fourth point is that one thing that we have learned emphatically in the years since the collapse of communism, and the great lesson of Yugoslavia, is that it is not possible to build a democracy within jurisdictions where the principal groups within that jurisdiction don't want to be part of it, don't want to live together peacefully. There is no democracy in Bosnia because the three major groups don't all want to live together. And so we have a Western constabulary that keeps them from each other's throats. So if Saddam is removed from power and if a concerted effort is made to build a democracy, an awful lot will depend upon whether the three principal constituent groups in Iraq, which is, after all, an artificial creation put together by the British for their own reasons in the wake of World War I, whether these three groups, the Sunni and Shia Arabs and the Kurds, are willing to live together peacefully in what would presumably be a much more federalized system with a fair distribution of the oil revenues, but whether, given those circumstances, they are willing to live in peace within a single sovereign Iraq. Now, I don't know whether they are, and I don't think anybody knows whether they are. They probably don't know whether they are. So if events unfold so as to test this hypothesis about democracy in Iraq, that, I think, will be the first and stiffest test.
Michael, thank you very much for a superb presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to go to the table?
Sure, be happy to.
One thing I want to discuss with